Mr. President, I come to the floor this afternoon to oppose the nomination of Betsy DeVos, President Trump's choice to be Secretary of Education. And I fundamentally disagree with my colleague from Texas who said earlier that this is a fight about power and who maintains power, whether it's going to stay in Washington or whether it's going to be in the state and local communities. In New Hampshire, we believe in local control of education. It's a bedrock of our public education system. And this fight is not about power in Washington versus power in the states. This is a fight about, are we going to continue to support our public school system, our system of public higher education? Or are we going to take the money out, the support out, the policies out, and put that into private schools, into religious schools, and gut the public education system in this country? You know, my parents were part of the greatest generation. I grew up in post-World War II America. They understood that the best way for me to have opportunities for the future, my sisters and me, was to make sure that we had a good education. And I benefited by going to great public schools in the state of Missouri, in the state of Pennsylvania, and I was also able to go to public higher education without the ability to attend a public university in Pennsylvania and then in West Virginia and in the state of Mississippi. I would not have been able to get a college education because my parents wouldn't have been able to afford to send me to a private school, just like they wouldn't have been able to afford to send me to private K through 12 schools. I'm proud of the schools that I attended and proud of the support that my parents and so many other parents gave to public schools in America. My children and grandchildren have benefited from the great public schools in New Hampshire. And as governor, I was proud to work with the Republican legislature to improve the schools in the state of New Hampshire. We expanded public kindergarten in our state because at the time I became governor, we didn't have public kindergarten for all students. And we were able to open the door for an additional 25,000 kids to go to public kindergarten. We were able to increase funding for schools in New Hampshire during my time as governor. And I learned during those experiences and also as a teacher, I taught in public schools in New Hampshire, in Dover, and also in Mississippi. I learned the connection between public education and good schools and our economy. Now, I taught in Mississippi in 1970. At that time, there was no public education in Mississippi that was a requirement for all students. So if you didn't want to go to school in the 70s in Mississippi, you didn't have to. And we saw the impact that that had on economic indicators in the state of Mississippi. Now, since then, they have adopted compulsory education for students in Mississippi. But it was a great lesson to me to see how important good schools are and a good education is to making sure we have a strong economy in this country. And if I talk, as governor, when I talked to businesses in the state of New Hampshire, one of the things they told me that they needed in order for their businesses to succeed was a skilled workforce. Young people who had a good education, who could learn the skills on the job, and they looked for communities to locate in where there was a strong system of public education in those communities. I value public schools as one of our nation's bedrock civic and democratic institutions because they provide the best opportunity for kids from all walks of life to get a quality education, and they pass on to each new generation, including the children of immigrants, America's shared ideals and values. Regrettably, after careful study of Mrs. DeVos' record as an activist, I have concluded that she doesn't agree with this view of our public schools. She has no relevant experience as a teacher, as a leader in public schools. She has never attended a public school, and she's not sent any of her children to a public school. To the contrary, she has spent her entire career and countless millions of dollars of her personal fortune working not to improve public schools, but to privatize them, to weaken them by diverting public funds to private and religious schools. And given her past record, it makes no sense to put Ms. DeVos in charge of the Department of Education unless the aim is to devalue, defund, and perhaps eventually destroy our public schools. And I think that's unacceptable. In my state of New Hampshire, support for our public schools is bipartisan and it's passionate. In rural communities, in small towns, and our cities across the state, our public schools are institutions that have support from communities. They're a big part of our communities' identities and shared experiences. And across centuries and generations in the Granite State, public schools have been at the heart of our common civic life. So I think it's not surprising that my office has been inundated with letters, with emails, with phone calls, strongly opposing the DeVos nomination. My office has received more than 4,000 letters and emails from Granite Staters. Now, that may not seem like a lot to somebody from the state of California, but from the state of New Hampshire to have 4,000 letters and emails on a nomination is unheard of. And almost all of them oppose this nomination. In addition, we've received 1,405 telephone calls in opposition and only 3 in support. 3, 1, 2, 3. 1,405 opposed and 3 in support. I'm impressed not only by the volume of constituent messages, but by the intensity of their opposition. Megan is a social studies teacher. She writes, and I quote, "Mrs. DeVos clearly lacks even a basic understanding of federal education policy, laws, and instructional practices. She has no relevant experience. There is just no way I would ever be certified to instruct students in New Hampshire if I lacked as much knowledge and experience in my field. But she gets to be the nation's chief educator? How is this good for kids?" End quote. Roger is a retired public school teacher from Concord, and he writes, quote, "Please reject DeVos because she's anti-public education in word and in practice, lacking the understanding of the public education system and having no understanding of the dreamers sitting in public schools this morning, creating their own American dreams, learning of the promise and justice that is America." End quote. And Sam from the Seacoast writes, "It's important that we maintain a strong public school system. This is not a partisan issue. Any person, regardless of party, can see that Ms. DeVos is unqualified to fill the position. You need to vote no to save our education system." And Mike from Durham writes, "I'm really concerned that we might have someone with so little experience in education and with seemingly anti-public education views as our next education leader. I fear that a DeVos confirmation will only exacerbate the already segregated school experiences that children have in our country. I want all students to have a fair shake at a high-quality school experience, not just ones who live in wealthy communities or who have parents savvy enough to advocate on their behalf." End quote. Now, many of the letters that I've received are from parents who are outraged about Ms. DeVos' comments on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is one of the landmark civil rights laws of the 20th century. In response to a question from my colleague, Senator Hassan, Ms. DeVos made it clear that she was unaware that that law was a federal law and that it governs our schools. IDEA ensures that children with disabilities have the opportunity to receive a free, appropriate public education, and that they are accommodated in our schools and classrooms, just like all other children. In her testimony, Ms. DeVos said that decisions about how to treat students with disabilities should be left to the states. Can you imagine what would happen in states who decide they don't want to make sure that those students can go to schools? I received this message from Marilyn, who lives in the western part of New Hampshire. She says, "Thank you for opposing the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Education Secretary. She is a dangerous, unqualified choice. As the parent of a daughter with Down syndrome, I fear for the future of IDEA if DeVos is in charge." And Ashley Preston, who was Teacher of the Year in New Hampshire in 2016, wrote this to me: "If our Secretary of Education does not understand and value the importance of federal laws such as IDEA, how can we expect states and local school districts to do that? These are the elements crucial to ensuring the best chance for our future." Well, the Department of Education has oversight not only of K through 12 public schools, but also higher education, including a portfolio of more than $1.2 trillion in federal student loans. I've had the opportunity not only to teach in our K through 12 schools, but to work in public universities in New Hampshire and in private universities. Listening to Ms. DeVos' testimony, I was appalled by her lack of understanding of higher education policy. She acknowledged that neither she nor her children had ever received a federal loan or a Pell Grant, and this is the worst part, when asked to commit to enforcing rules that ensure students aren't cheated and end up with no degree but a mountain of student debt, in other words, the predicament of students who went to Trump University and so many other private for-profit colleges, she refused to do that. She refused to say this is something that we should support as a policy in America. I'm also deeply concerned by her support for charter schools that are not accountable, and her reputation as, quote, the four-star general of the voucher movement. Now, I believe there's a role for charter schools. I think as we try to improve our public system of higher education, we need to look at a number of models. I voted for New Hampshire's charter school law, but we should hold them accountable, just like we hold our public schools accountable. We should ensure that they don't drain resources from public schools. There was a report that came out in 2012 or 2013 that was done by a working group under the auspices of the Annenberg Institute for Social Reform. And one of the things they discovered in their report were some similar challenges across charter schools. They found that there was uneven academic performance, that some of them had overly harsh discipline practices, that funding sometimes destabilized traditional schools, that there was a lack of transparency and oversight that led to conflicts of interest and in some cases fraud, and that many of them practiced policies that kept students out for various reasons. Now, Ms. DeVos was one of the architects of Michigan's first charter school law in 1993. It's been widely criticized for lacking accountability and safeguards for students. In her confirmation hearing, Ms. DeVos refused to agree that for-profit charter schools should be held to the same standards as public schools. And just as disturbing is her support for school vouchers, which would siphon funding from public schools and divert it to private and religious schools. Advocates of vouchers like to call it school choice. But in practice, parents have learned that choice is not a reality. Florida, under Governor Jeb Bush, was the first state to enact a statewide voucher system. And nearly 93% of private and parochial schools in Florida, after that law, refused to accept any voucher students. In New Hampshire, we have parts of the state where if we don't have public schools, there are no other choices for our students. I don't care whether you've got a voucher or not. You can't drive 3 or 4 hours to get to the next public school or the next private school. So let's be clear. Vouchers and other privatization schemes advocated by Ms. DeVos, they're not about pedagogy. They're about ideology. They're all about disdain for what many voucher advocates like to call government schools. Well, government schools are public schools. They're schools that our communities have for their kids. And what Ms. DeVos fails to understand is that quality education has nothing to do with whether a school is public or private. We have public schools in New Hampshire that we need to work on. But what counts are high-quality teachers, it's support from parents and communities, it's facilities where kids can enjoy learning and be safe, it's rigorous academic standards, and it's the resources to make sure that children can get the learning that they need, including individualized assistance to kids with special needs. What counts is the political and budgetary commitment to create high-quality schools in every neighborhood, regardless of zip code. Because Betsy DeVos doesn't understand these basic truths about education in America, because she's driven by an ideological hostility to our public schools, she is the wrong person to serve as our Secretary of Education. I intend to vote no on the nomination of Ms. DeVos, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in rejecting this unqualified nominee.